Okay, hi and welcome. This is Angela Power Disney again with chapter 3 of the rare book by Tim Tate, Children for the Devil, Ritual Abuse and Satanic Crime. One of the three most authoritative scholarly books written on the subject, and a difficult subject to engage with. So I just acknowledge those that are doing so. This is important, especially for professionals, police, therapists, church leaders, and parents, really, because a lot of the children, although many were from intergenerational families, there were others that were unaware and horrified when they found out the truth. So this is important. So chapter 3, A Darker God. The definition, Oxford Etymological Dictionary, the definition of Satan, Satan, Ha-Satan, the Hebrew definition is an enemy, and it also means to persecute. So on August 12th, 1990, the Independent on Sunday newspaper published the verdict of an investigation into satanic ritual abuse. Quote, over the past 2 years, the British public has been hearing more and more about this apparently new phenomenon as social workers, psychiatrists, therapists, the NSPCC, voluntary groups, and ourselves and churches all report a growing number of cases of satanic ritual abuse. But are these satanic abuse survivors' stories fantasy or fact? Are children in Britain being sadistically abused and tortured by witches and Satanists in covens? Are teenage girls being used as broodmares, made pregnant and fetus aborted so it can be sacrificed and in some cases eaten? More and more childcare specialists are telling us yes. But an investigation by the Independent on Sunday has found that nobody has produced evidence to support these claims. The allegations began to surface only after the publication of the book Michelle Remembers. The reporter who conducted the investigation, Rosie Waterhouse, will feature again when we come to consider the press reporting of satanic ritual abuse cases. But how true is her central premise? The allegations of ritual abuse only began after the publication of Dr. Lawrence Pastor's pioneering work with Michelle Smith. The answer is as simple as it is important. Satanic ritual crime, abuse, and murder have been reported, investigated, proven, and recorded for more than 500 years. Defining Satanism. Before we examine the historic ties that bind the practice of Satanism to the abuse and sacrifice of children, we need to define our terminology. We also need to remember that whilst our regular society may choose to ignore or even ridicule all forms of religious worship, what matters is not what we believe, but what the followers of any particular sect or cult accept as reality. Faith in a personal God or a personal devil make little sense to some people, but to the devout Christian or Satanist, it is central. Just want to play some music because this is difficult stuff to digest. Again, I should have set that up, but I was quite triggered after yesterday's reading, I'll be honest with you. There were some things resonating and just a difficult thing to read and to hear. I appreciate that too. Right, thanks for that pause. Before we examine the historic ties that bind the practice of Satanism to the abuse and sacrifice of children, we need to define our terminology. We also need to remember that whilst our regular society may choose to ignore or even ridicule all forms of religious worship, What matters is not what we believe, but what the followers of any particular sect or cult accept as reality. I read that. In the course of her quote-unquote investigation, Waterhouse used the words witchcraft and Satanism without distinction. Yet they describe very different religions. The former, largely benign, witchcraft he's referring to. The latter, generally malevolent. The blurring of this vital religious difference, as fundamental as that between Judaism and Christianity, has led to an alarming and unedifying witch hunt by some politicians, Christians, and newspapers. Satanism is, in essence, an inversion of Christianity. Certainly, there can be no belief in Satan, let alone worship of him, without a corresponding acceptance of the reality of Christ. This alone distinguishes Satanism from witchcraft and all other pagan religions. Almost every mainstream religion has a devil-like figure. Teutonic mythology represents Loki, formerly the god of fire, as the personification of evil. In pre-Christian Egypt and Babylon, the gods Apepi and Tiamat had aspects of the later Satanic personality. The ancient Mexican god of hell, Mictlantecutli, was almost identical with the traditional image of Satan. Yet although the concept we know today as Satan has grown up within the developing teachings of the Christian Church, the variety of names and pseudonyms, the physical characteristics, and the belief in the devil's unlimited power for evil are in fact drawn from the Greek gods and medieval Christianity, spiced with liberal borrowings from other traditions. The word Satan is Hebrew and literally means an enemy or an opponent. It occurs frequently in the Old Testament, generally preceded by the indefinite article. So rather than Satan appearing as a single living spirit of evil, the Hebrew writers referred to a Satan, or occasionally several of them. The only points at which a distinct single personality is discernible occur within the book of Job and the prophecy of Zechariah. In Job, Satan is evidently associated with the sons of God and stands with them before the throne of Jehovah. He acts as a constant critic of Job's actions and tests them at every point. Yet there is no indication that he is in opposition to God or in any way the personification of evil. Zechariah paints a marginally more antagonistic figure, Satan as the opponent of the high priest Joshua. Yet even here, he's not entirely devoid of virtuous characteristics, and indeed appears to be involved in some form of judicial process on behalf of Jehovah. This Hebrew view of Satan, which we must count as the earliest forerunner of the modern concept, was probably formed during the period immediately following the exile of the children of Israel. The Hebrews lived among the Babylonians, who believed in the existence of a vast pantheon of good and bad spirits, and it appears that some of these were welded into the embryonic Satan figure. Later, the Persian Asmodeus, second in command to Abraman, the prince of evil, and the Greek godchild Astaroth were absorbed into the Judaic tradition. By the time the New Testament writers came to record the stories of Jesus Christ, the familiar figure of Satan is beginning to emerge, and with it, alternative names like Lucifer or simply the devil. Matthew's Gospel refers to him as the Prince of Demons. In St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he rules over a world of evil beings who live in lower heavens. With his character established as wholly evil, and with a reported tendency to tempting the good and great into sin, the New Testament Satan set the tone for the ensuing millennia. His physical representation owes much to the Knights Templar. Founded in 1119 by a French knight, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, and Hugh de Payne from Burgundy, the order was originally a blend of muscular Christianity with red-blooded medieval militarism. The Templars existed to protect pilgrims making the dangerous journey from Christendom to the Holy Land, and to this end practiced strict discipline and a certain Christian asceticism. But along the way, they adopted a pagan idol to worship, Baphomet. Baphomet usually takes the shape of a goat, complete with hooves, horns, and beard. There, however, the animal ends and the human begins. Contemporary and current representations show that Baphomet was endowed both with female breasts and an erect penis. He is generally depicted wearing a 5-pointed star or pentagram. This portrait, supplemented with the existing Olympian goat figure of the Dionysus, the sometime Greek god and patron of fertility and alcoholic indulgence, formed the basis of the goat image of Satan. By the 13th century, the Templars were accused of worshipping the devil in the form of Baphomet during a wide variety of what we would now recognize as satanic type rituals. Before we come to examine the history and practice of satanic rituals, we need to highlight the difference between the satanic god, recognizable from the 12th century, and that of a genuine witchcraft. It was a distinction not always made in the Middle Ages, causing a confusion which has lasted ever since, separating Satanism from witchcraft. The words witch and witchcraft stem from the Saxon word Wicca. This in itself was a contraction of the Witega, which translates as prophet or sorcerer. The basis of the religion of witchcraft predates Christianity, and quite probably the Judaism expounded in much of the Old Testament. Prehistoric man was a hunter-gatherer, ruled on the whole by the elements and available wildlife. For primitive man, the elements were a superior force which ordered his very existence on the earth. From the earliest Indo-European races to the later Nordic and Roman societies, the sky was a supreme and living being who punished them when angry by sending flashes of lightning and claps of thunder. Nature played God and was worshipped as such. Among the scattered communities, women held a position of prominence over men and gradually became accepted as a channel to the gods of nature. The concept of a priestess became established. The god of the sky was similarly female, symbolized by the moon and with 3 aspects to match the lunar phases: the maid, the mother, and the wise ancient, represented by the new, the full, and the waning moon. Gradually, the men built up a god of their own, based on their separate hunting tradition. This god was symbolically animal, a horned beast who looked after man's well-being on earth and his passage through the dark and unknown world of death. Because of the essentially pastoral life led by early man, dependence on the weather for the success of his crops, his beasts, and indeed his own offspring, both the moon goddess and the horned god were essentially concerned with fertility. The earliest rituals recorded were this seasonal worshippers paying homage in the hope of fertility being bestowed on their fields, animals, and women. By the time of Christ, this ritual pantheistic religion, which became known as Wicca, based on the 2 figures of the horned god and the moon goddess, by now also known by the Roman name Diana, was well established throughout Europe. Although the early church attempted to suppress this ancient religion as worship of its own devil, the earliest recorded condemnation of the worship of Diana appeared in the abbot of Prum's Canon Episcopi in 906. Satan actually had no relevance to the religion of Wicca. But in the ensuing centuries, as Christianity spread its organization even further, Diana and the horned god came, confusingly, to be viewed as aspects of the Christian devil instead of as independent pagan gods. Inevitably, this early Christian obsession with denouncing any rival religion in terms of its own belief in a personal power of evil had a cross-fertilizing effect. The history of medieval witchcraft shows quite clearly that many witches began to believe in and worship the Christian figure of Satan alongside those of the moon goddess and the horned god. Nonetheless, in theological terms, this was a distraction from the genuine pagan belief system. While medieval man and the church-dominated states of the Middle Ages confused witchcraft with Satanism, it is important for us to distinguish between them. The two are separate religions with only occasional movement between them. Above all, the practice of and spiritual convictions behind their rituals are entirely different. Early Satanic ritual. If the image of a goat and the persona of pure evil were developed as Satan's trademarks by the 13th century, the form of Satanic worship was beginning to be similarly recognizable. Ironically, its source was a well-organized movement of Christian monks. Just as the ascetic Templars provided the image of Satan in the shape of Baphomet, the liturgy of his worship was the product of a similar muscular mysticism. Monks known as Cathars and later Bogomils, who were centered initially around the monasteries of Central Europe, developed a doctrine of Christianity based on Gnostic dualism. It was to become the basis of all Satanic liturgy. These first Cathars did not merely mortify the flesh, they hated it with a barely controlled passion. And yet traditional Christian doctrine taught that God had created all things, including the much despised flesh and all its pleasures. In order to navigate an intellectual path through this paradox, the monks created their own Gnostic theology of dualism. All things spiritual were created by God, all matters corporeal by Satan. As a result, they were to discourage marriage, abstain from all animal food, except fish, which they believed were not produced by sexual intercourse, and practice severe flagellation. It also followed logically from this view of all things corporeal that these Cathar monks could not acknowledge either Christ as genuinely the Son of God, since he was human flesh and blood, or the organization which called itself his church and which required just such an acceptance. Cathar theology required the specific denial of the church, the cross, and particularly the Mass. Inevitably, Cathar liturgy reflected this. Nor did these ascetic monks stop at mere intellectual debate within their monasteries. The Cathar church was extremely well organized, with its own rival hierarchy of bishops, priests, and deacons. Its aim was not just the substitution of the Cathar brand of Christianity for that of the Catholic Church, but the overthrow of a society they saw as fundamentally corrupt. The Cathars began their 12th and 13th centuries to spread across Europe, generally by infiltrating themselves into the established church. These undercover priests would then begin to subvert the rituals and practice of Orthodox Christianity. All of this would be of little importance outside the narrow confines of ecclesiastical history had all the Cathars stuck to their strict principles. In fact, many did not. They developed a doctrine that only the perfect were guaranteed salvation, and if those who were not in this elect band backslid, this was entirely due to the convenient fact that they were the product of the devil, not of God. So many Cathar monks covertly abandoned their pledge of celibacy, but instead of normal sex, they practiced sodomy, reasoning that this at least did not involve them in the crime of procreation. Gradually, the Cathar denunciations of Orthodox Christianity became incorporated into their saying of the Mass. Christ and the cross were reviled and denounced. Simultaneously, their unorthodox sexual activities became established as part of the proceedings. Although most Cathars could never be called Satanists, in many of their later rituals, the embryonic Black Mass is clear. That Mass has been the central feature of Satanic worship from the Middle Ages to the present day. Until the 13th century, the Christian Church had been relatively lax in suppressing rival religions. Witchcraft was a crime, but a crime amongst others. The Cathar heresy changed all that. In 1208, Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against the Cathars, claiming that they were convert Satanists. The mass anti-Cathar crusade, which swept across Europe, was the precursor of the Inquisition. The latter was a crusade very different for the anti-Cathar drive and was established in 1233 by the Catholic Church to root out and punish all false doctrine and heresy, quote unquote. It was a wide brief, made broader still by the Vatican's encouragement to use whatever methods, from torture to murder, its Inquisition might find appropriate. The Inquisition was a bloody blot on history which was to last more than 500 years. One of the first witch trials set the tone, both in the use of torture to obtain confessions and in the historic relationship between child sacrifice and alleged devil worship. In 1275, Inquisitor Hugo de Bagnols sat in Toulouse, hearing the confession of a 60-year-old woman charged with heresy. Angèle de la Barthe also faced another more serious charge, that she had indulged in sexual intercourse with a demon and given birth to a monster. According to her confession, this creature ate only the flesh of dead babies. And so, Angèle explained, she either murdered children or dug up freshly buried corpses to feed her unnatural offspring. The confession of Angèle de la Barthe, and of many thousands like her, must be viewed with extreme suspicion. But in amongst the admissions extracted by torture during the Inquisition are useful and seemingly reliable first-hand accounts of genuinely satanic ritual. Brackets, the largely scholarly accounts given by the French academic de l'Ancre in his books L'Inconstance and L'Incrédulité from the 1613 to 1622 clearly illustrate the emerging motifs of satanic worship. The confession made in June 1335 by one Catherine de Laure at a mass trial of 63 Toulouse men and women on charges of witchcraft and sorcery has the ring of authenticity. She admitted to having murdered 2 of her aunts and went on to give a description of events at a Shabbat she had attended. Shabbats were the quarterly meetings of witches and Satanists held on the 2nd of February, Candlemas Day in the Christian calendar, and the 31st of March, the 1st of August, the Christian Lammas Day, and the 31st of October, Halloween. They reflected not seasonal equinoxes, nor the agricultural divisions of the year, but rather the breeding seasons of cattle, and dated back to Paleolithic, man's horned god. Delors explained that she has sacrificed cattle at the Sabbath, Sabbath, and that many of the worshippers had eaten the flesh of children who were also killed during the ceremonies. Inquisitor Guy pressed Delors and a fellow defendant, Henri de Georges, on the nature of their religion and the reasons for its rituals. Both promptly echoed the Cathar theology. They insisted that, although God was the king of heaven, Satan was the lord of this world, and the two were in conflict. De Georges stated that she believed Satan was then in the ascendant, and that his ultimate triumph was assured, hence the bloody rituals she had attended. The Cathar Satan had, by 1335, become the god of at least some of those the church called witches. In their confessions, we can see the origins of satanic liturgy and practice. These Toulouse descriptions are, although part of a witchcraft trial, among the earliest accounts of satanic ritual on record. Unusually for the Inquisition, some academic historians accept the two women's testimonies as relatively credible. But the main feature of satanic worship, the Black Mass, was yet to emerge. The Black Mass. In part, the reason for this was the terminology of the early witch-finders. They made no distinction between what we would recognize as a witch's Shabbat, i.e. one in which the moon goddess or horn god were worshipped, and a genuine satanic ceremony. Yet there were clear differences. The witches' Shabbats, hangovers from the pre-Christian era, contain no reference to Christ, nor any Christian symbolism. The satanic ceremony was specific in its anti-Christian liturgy. The earliest forms of Black Mass recorded by contemporary Inquisition historians bear striking similarities to some of the disclosures of children made more than 700 years later. The best descriptions, translated and collated by the historian Henry Rhodes, were published in 1954, a full 26 years before Lawrence Pasda wrote, Michel remembers, quote, "The places of worship were large areas of flat country and where possible tableland. It was essential that one end of the ground should be wooded, presumably to form a grove. This was the choir and sanctuary, the open ground being the equivalent of the nave. At the extreme end of the grove was an altar built of stones. Upon it stood a large wooden image of Satan. The body was human, the head, hands, and feet goat-like. Stained black, the image in some cases carried a small burning torch between the horns and was adorned with a virile member. The priestess was frequently a young girl. Under her direction, those present in the sanctuary lit their torches from the one attached to the horns of the image. The priestess then opened with the words, 'I will come to the altar. Save me, Lord Satan, from the treacherous and the violent.' Following the entourage and the prayer was the ceremonial kiss, applied apparently to the hindquarters of the image. But according to some accounts, the priestess kissed the phallus of the god. Thank you for the blood of Jesus protecting me from all this. The accounts went on to describe a banquet in which all the celebrants mixed alcohol with trance-inducing herbs prior to dancing around in a circle to produce a state of spiritual ecstasy. After the climax of this part of the ceremony, the priestess became the altar. Lying naked on top the pile of stones, her functions were taken over by a male worshipper who symbolized and was called the devil. An inverted version of the Christian creed was recited, substituting Satan for Christ. Following on from this ritual, the priestess was mutilated and tortured slowly in a fire. Her body remained in place and continued to be used as an altar. On it were offered up variously wheat, fruit, and sacrificed animals. A subsequent orgy between adults and children typically involved sodomy rather than vaginal sexual intercourse. At some point, supplications were made to Lucifer, though it is far from clear whether he was seen as a separate demonic figure or as part of the one satanic image. The hallmarks of the embryonic Black Mass are clear in these accounts, dating probably from the middle of the 14th century. During the following century, we find the processes refined and the first specific proven case of satanic ritual child abuse. Gilles de Rais has a variety of claims on history. Born in 1404, the son of a leading Breton noble, he grew up to become one of the richest men in Europe. He enjoyed a career as a notable soldier, distinguishing himself in the 100 Years' War and becoming the confidant and constant bodyguard of Jeanne d'Arc. After her execution, which he witnessed, de Rais retired from the army and applied himself to occultism. It was this obsession that led him to become the first recorded mass murderer of children in satanic rituals. The 19th century French chronicler of satanic worship, Carl Huysmans, wrote that, compared to Gilles de Rais, the Marquis de Sade is only a timid bourgeois, a mediocre fantasist. De Rais gathered around him a group of sophisticated fellow occultists and by his own admission entered into a ritual pact with the devil. At his castle of Tiffauges, he locked himself and his co-worshippers into the cellar to practice what he called ritual magic. The attempts were to last for more than 8 years. Nor were they confined to mere academic occult meditation. By the year 1432, he was regularly giving orders to his servants to procure local children, generally boys between the ages of 6 and 12, for use in the ceremonies. Within the rituals, the children were first sexually abused by the adult men, then killed, frequently at the point of the men's orgasms, as part of a rite to give spiritual power to the group. After the killings, the children's mutilated bodies would again be sexually assaulted. The cult would then burn the bodies. The records of de Rais' subsequent trial contain the confession that he and his fellow occultists carried out the rituals in the name of Satan, and that in doing so, they murdered more than 800 children. Quote, he sat on their bellies and took immense pleasure in seeing them die thus and laughed over it. Close quotes. Quote, he took more pleasure in killing them and watching them droop and die and seeing their blood than in lechery with them. Reading the first-hand accounts of de Rais and his French cult is a startling experience. The content of de Rais' confession of, according to the anthropologist Dr. Margaret Murray, Joan of Arc's death by burning was a deliberate ritual, a sacrifice in which de Rais played an enthusiastic role. So the contents of de Rais' confession of October 1440, supported independently by his servant and child procurer Poitou, and by his fellow Satanist Francesco Prelati, are all but identical with those of the English mental patient whose disclosures to a psychiatrist in August 1987 prompted the research that led to this book. What makes the coincidence the more curious is that de Retz' confessions are not widely published or circulated. If the mental patient was modelling the disclosures on those made 547 years earlier, intense and geographically diverse research would have been required. The similarities between historic satanic worship and post-1989 stories of ritual child abuse do not end with Gilles Rey. Subsequent cases from the Middle Ages to the early years of the 20th century maintain the pattern. If de Retz' rituals were the first formal recording of child abuse and murder within satanic ritual, the liturgy of the Black Mass itself developed apace. By 1597, the French historian Florent de Raymond was able to recount the contemporary rites of the Black Mass. A black goat with horns presided over the ritual. It is clear from the accounts that this was believed to be the devil, though it is clearly likely to have been a man wearing some form of costume. The ceremony proceeded much as recorded by Inquisition historians, until a young girl was presented to the Satan figure for initiation. After giving him a lock of her hair, she was taken to the wooded grove, representing the sanctuary in a Christian church, and sexually abused, suffering extreme pain. The ritual dancing ensued prior to the start of the Mass itself. In place of the Christians' bread wafer representing Christ's body, a piece of black turnip was used. Turnip was a common bread substitute throughout Europe in time of famine. Water replaced wine in the chalices, and urine was sprinkled on the celebrants instead of holy water. The chants proclaimed Satan master, God, and creator. The same theological view was echoed 35 years later at Loudun in the province of Poitiers by Urbain Grandier. His case also formally acknowledged what had become common practice. The Black Mass was being celebrated by rogue priests, some of them part of a Cathar rump, who took pains to seduce other Christians into their satanic rituals. Urbain Grandier was a priest himself. He had earned by 1633 a reputation as a womanizer, not uncommon in itself for priests at that time, and a seducer of young virgins. When finally accused of bewitching local nuns and introducing them to devil worship, his home was searched and a pact with Satan, written in Latin and backwards, discovered. And I quote, again, standing protected by my Saviour, Jesus Christ, quote, "My Lord and Master, I own you for my God. I promise to serve you while I live, and from this hour I renounce all other gods and Jesus Christ and Mary and all the saints of heaven and the Catholic, Apostolic and Roman Church and all the goodwill thereof and the prayers which might be made for me. I promise to adore you and do you homage at least 3 times a day, and to do the most evil that I can, and to lead into evil as many persons as shall be possible to me. And heartily I renounce the Christ, baptism, and all the merits of Jesus Christ. And in case I should desire to change, I give you my body and soul and my life, as holding it from you, having dedicated it forever without any will to repent. Signed, Urbain Grandier, in his blood." This is the ritual of selling your soul to the devil. Grandier held good to his promise. He seduced into Satanism the nuns of his local convent. In rituals directed to the devil figure Asmodeus, his cult blasphemed and took part in orgies within the holiest places of his church. It was to be the first of a number of similar outbreaks of satanic worship within French churches involving black masses, specifically directed at defiling Christianity. Within a decade of Grandier's trial and execution, nuns at the Monastère de Saint-Louis de Louviers in Paris were under investigation for Satanism. The accounts of the developing Black Mass and the involvement of children were revealing. According to Sister Magdalene Bavon, the process had begun in 1633 under the tutelage of a rogue priest and father confessor to the nuns. Father David's personal theology was that Cathar dualism, and in common with many of the later Cathar monks, he had lapsed into a life of vice. David encouraged the nuns to go naked about their devotions and to practice lesbianism in the chapel. He sent them to communion stripped to the waist, and on several occasions had blasphemed by throwing the consecrated hosts onto the nearby dunghill. When David died, his place as chaplain was taken by Father Mathurin Picard and his assistant, Father Thomas Bouet. Both priests continued the sacrilegious and sexually inappropriate habits of their predecessor, but Picard gave them specific direction. Under his auspices, the nuns began taking part in satanic black masses. The ceremonies involved sexual intercourse with, quote-unquote, the devil, priests dressed as half animals reading from a book of blasphemies, the crucifixion of a newly born baby, and the murder of at least 2 men who had come as voyeurs and were killed when they tried to leave. Quote, the evil doing, mainly of the priests who attended these nighttime assemblies, reaches such a point that they often bring hosts, communion bread wafers, consecrated in the church, place them on a kind of altar which is there. Then they say their mass. Afterwards, they take them up again, take out a circle from the center the size of a quarter crown, put them onto a piece of vellum or parchment, pierced and cut out in the same way, and stick them down with a sort of grease resembling pitch. Then they pass them over their private parts as far up as the belly, and in this state abandon themselves to the company of women. Unsurprisingly, the sexual activity between nuns and priests and/or Satan bore fruit. Magdalene Bavon herself admitted to becoming pregnant, but failed to explain what happened to the baby. She did, however, give an insight into the fate of others. Quote, on Maundy Thursday, I saw the Lord's Supper being celebrated in a horrible way. A roasted child was brought in. It was eaten by the assembly, and I could not say with certainty whether I tasted it. I told my confessor that I thought I had, and that I stopped eating it at once because the meat was tasteless. But the most remarkable thing was that during this disgusting feast, a demon went round the table crying, not one of you will betray me. I myself believe that with these words, they are renewing their intentions not to accuse each other, so as to be faithful to the devil. Magdalene Bavon's remarkable and very clear testimony is useful in that it not highlighted the existence in 17th century France of precisely the sort of banquet that the 15-year-old survivor Natalie described taking place in London in 1988, but because it gives the first indication of a particular motive for the abuse and killing of children in satanic rituals. Until the Louviers case, such abuse had been primarily aimed at defilement of the Christian image of purity, symbolized by the innocence of children, though the rites practiced by Gilles de Rais hinted at a belief in a power to be released through their death. Bavon's confession took the explanation or the Satanic belief system one stage further. Quote, on the Sabbath they cast many evil spells, compounded of sacred hosts, the blood that sometimes drips from them. Bavon insisted that as the nuns stabbed the wafers during the ceremonies, blood occasionally oozed out, and the principal internal parts of the bodies of children or of other dead people. They ate like little balls. I cannot think of any other name for them. Madeleine Bavon escaped lightly for all her crimes, spiritual and secular. She was condemned as a witch by the church and exiled to an Ursuline convent in Rouen. But unlike the rogue priest Buet and several of his fellow Satanists, she was not executed. She died in 1647. Detailed as the Louviers case was, the most explicit recording of satanic ritual, and with it ritual child abuse and sacrifice, came 30 years later. It was also the first case investigated by a secular, albeit Catholic, detective rather than a witch-hunting priest. Significantly, it produced another first, tangible forensic evidence to support testimony and confession. The Guibourg Mass. On the 8th of March, 1679, Nicolas de la Reynie received royal approval to start investigating allegations of a secret cult of sorcerers. De la Reynie was Commissioner of Police for Paris. The king was Louis XIV. What began under the anonymous title Commission de l'Arsenal and was subsequently known as L'Affaire de la Chambre Ardente was to threaten each in very different ways. The case had its origins in a tip-off 6 years earlier. Two priests informed the police that they had been asked to hear a string of confessions from both men and women that they had murdered their spouses. The priests refused, however, to breach the confidentiality of the confessional booth and had named no names. It took de la Reynie and his colleagues 4 years to fit together enough pieces to request clearance for an investigation. What the detectives believed they were confronting in 1678 was an organized ring of fortune tellers or sorcerers supplying what they euphemistically described as succession powders to wealthy Parisian aristocrats. The powders were poisons. The customers, anxious to rid themselves of the encumbrance of marriage, whilst succeeding to the wealth of their spouses, hence the name succession powders. Nicolas de la Reynie was patient and methodical. Although a Christian, brackets, it would have been highly unusual for a 17th century Parisian police chief not to have been a practicing Catholic, he took no interest in the theological implications of what his investigations were to uncover. He was a detective first and last, and that so much reliable detail of French satanic ritual crime was recorded is both a tribute to his professionalism and an eloquent condemnation of the shoddy amateurism of many modern-day law enforcement departments. Although his periodic use of torture is less laudable, even in an age where such punishments were the norm. Brackets, it's partly because of de la Reynie's attention to detail that we know so much more about 17th century French Satanism than its practice in any other country. Nonetheless, there is strong evidence that similar and contemporary black masses were being celebrated throughout Germany, Austria, Spain, Italy, and England. The key to uncovering an organization far more grotesque and widespread than de la Reynie could have guessed was a chance remark by a local fortune teller, Marie Bosse. Bosse confided to a police informant that she had been about to retire when 3 more customers asking for succession powders had persuaded her to change her mind. De la Reynie sent an undercover policewoman to consult Boss on the best way to rid herself of a troublesome husband. When the fortune teller prescribed and provided poison, the disguised officer arrested her. A search of Boss's home produced an impressive inventory of poisons and 4 more arrests. Her husband, 2 sons, and another fortune teller known as La Vigoureuse, who slept with each member of the Boss family, were quickly interviewed. Nicolas de la Reynie soon faced a severe political problem. The 5 poisoners were eagerly providing a lengthy list of customers for their powders. Almost all were wealthy aristocrats at Louis XIV's court. The police commissioner persuaded the king to set up a special commission of inquiry, using the entirely plausible argument that if half the aristocracy were attempting to poison each other in pursuit of unrestricted sexuality, then the next victim might be Louis himself. The inquiry, authorized on the 8th of March 1679, was deliberately dressed in suitable sombre trappings. La Reynie might officially be investigating a mass poisoning scandal, but the confessions from the family Boss had made it clear that some of their colleagues were involved in obscene devil-worshipping rituals. In a room draped entirely with black curtains and lit only by candles, hence its chambre ardente nickname, the police commissioner interrogated witnesses in front of a supervisory panel of judges. Marie Boss and La Vigoureuse constantly identified 2 other occultists as the chief organizers of the rituals. They were known as La Voisin and La Lapère. The middle years of 17th century France had been called by social historians the age of arsenic. The period saw a simultaneous surge of interest in facial cosmetics and in the murderous dispatch by poison of aristocratic spouses. In both, arsenic was the key ingredient. Catherine de Chay was a petty bourgeoise married to a failed haberdasher who saw a niche in both markets. She first set up in business creating arsenic compounds for skin cleansing. De Chay took her work seriously, investigating a variety of chemicals with an impressive empiricism. Along the way, she developed a quite legitimate interest in medicinal drugs and concocted a number of relatively successful potions. Ironically, given her subsequent career, she took as her motto the theory that inner cleanliness was more important than external treatment. To boost her business, de Chay quickly added astrology and magic services to her repertoire. In an age when even Wiccan cults regularly invoked a bewildering roll call of devils and demons to aid their rituals, it was only to be expected that de Chay's magic would swiftly take on a darker hue. De Chay was happy to exploit the prevailing mood, but she was also a shrewd operator. Her astrology business catered particularly for the society ladies of salon and court. To ensure that she could provide a relevant prediction, de Chay insisted that all her clients consulted her unmasked. Although she never attended court, she built up an impressive intelligence network permeating almost every level of Parisian society. The organization was run exclusively by women, all of whom used nicknames. Marie Boss was known prosaically as La Bosse. Additionally, there were within its inner council the Boss family friend, La Vigoureuse, a woman known as La Trianon, and François Filastre, de Chay's goddaughter, who used the pseudonym La Filastre. De Chay was unquestionably the leader and known as La Voisin, the widow. By 1666, Catherine de Chay had earned enough from her business to pay 30,000 livres for a secluded house in a desolate neighborhood. The Rue Beauregard lay in a suburb just south of Saint-Denis, then known as Villeneuve, later as La Garenne. La Voisin's chosen premises were concealed behind high trees and surrounded by a tall protective wall. I can't help thinking of the children's home Haute de la Garenne in Jersey. The inner council of the business operated from, but didn't live in, the house. That was shared by de Chay, her daughter, and her husband, by now a travelling jeweller. Additionally, and importantly for what was to follow, the local executioner, Nicolas Levasseur, lodged with La Voisin for a time. Villeneuve had never been a fashionable area, but after La Voisin took up residence, Rue Beauregard became extremely busy. Her visitors were almost exclusively women, in theory anonymous, but their coaches frequently bore noble insignia and coats of arms. Catherine de Chay was no longer a simple beautician. She had abandoned her legitimate dabbling in medicines. By 1667, her poisons business was something of a sideline. She and her colleagues had become part-time abortionists and full-time Satanists. When he interrogated La Bosse, La Reine had yet to establish the real identity of La Voisin, where she lived, and precisely what she did during her satanic rituals. He ordered careful surveillance of a dubious pharmacist, which in turn points the investigation first at Villeneuve in general, and then at the house in Rue Beauregard. With the occupation established, La Reine turned his attention to the occupant, Catherine de Chay. He was lucky. Some of his assistants, including La Vigoureuse, had a weakness for alcohol. It was not long before an undercover policeman was present at a liberally wine-soaked supper. The table talk was relatively vague, but still clear enough to confirm the suggestion of devil worship. Quickly, La Reine picked up two of the celebrants. Under severe interrogation, they confessed to taking part in black masses and implicated La Voisin in acts of obscene ritual slaughter. Their testimony might have been discarded as unreliable, given the means of its extraction, had a follow-up raid on the house at Rue Beauregard not yielded tangible proof of the most serious allegations. The picture that emerged was startling. De Chay, together with a 66-year-old priest, l'Abbé Guibourg, regularly conducted black masses at a pavilion in the grounds of the house. La Reine's officers made a detailed inventory of the furnishings and contents of what was without a doubt a satanic temple. The walls were completely draped in black with a white cross embroidered at one end. In front of the cross was an altar, again covered in black and with black candles at either end. In front of the altar, Guibourg conducted the ceremonies. On top of it lay the celebrant, usually a woman, naked with her legs open. Guibourg, wearing an orb embroidered with black phallic symbols, approached the altar, intoning the entourage, the first of the 5 sections of the ritual, with the congregation completing the responses as in traditional Catholic Mass. Guibourg, in the name of our great God, again quoting, Guibourg, in the name of our great God Satan, I will go into the altar of the infernal Lord. All, to him who gives joy unto me. Guibourg, our help is in the name of the infernal Lord. All who reigns on earth. Guibourg, Thine is the earth, Lord Satan. Thou hast founded the earth and the fullness thereof. Justice and luxury are the preparation of thy throne. Princes sat and spoke against me, and the wicked persecuted me. Help me, Lord Satan, or keep me, Lord Satan, from the hands of the wicked. I rebuke that in Jesus' name. The chalice and wafer, which had been stolen from the tabernacle of a local church, rested on the belly of the celebrant lying on the altar. Throughout the ensuing offertory, canon, consecration, and repudiation, they were variously used and abused to blaspheme against Christian belief in the name of Satan. During the canon, either a young girl or boy was required to urinate into the chalice before Gibor sprinkled the liquid over the congregation. In the consecration, the wafer was pressed against the breasts and the vagina of the celebrant lying on the altar. In the repudiation, Gibor presented it to Satan, pressed it onto his penis, and pushed it inside the vagina of the woman on the altar, chanting, Lord Satan saith, in rioting and drunkenness I rise again. You shall fulfill the lusts of the flesh. The works of the flesh are manifest, which are fornication, immodesty, luxury, witchcraft, drunkenness, and reveling. My flesh is meat indeed. For the routine rituals at Rue Beauregard, this was the signal for an orgy of indiscriminate sex to begin. But La Reynie's investigations unearthed compelling evidence that Gibor and Deschet had practiced a particularly obscene variant for a growing number of society clients. From the point at the beginning of the offertory where the sanctified host was presented, the text changed dramatically. It was, for a start, addressed to two particular named aspects of the satanic image, Astaroth, Asmodeus, Princess of Friendship. I beg you to accept the sacrifice of this child, which we now offer to you for the things I ask of you. La Reynie's first reliable testimony detailing child sacrifice in the pavilion came from Deschet's daughter, Marie-Marguerite Monvoisin, in the spring of 1680. Marie was 21 and had previously given La Reynie detailed descriptions of animal sacrifices and the drinking of their blood. But the account of the child's ritual death was more detailed still. She said she watched as Gibor held the infant by its heels and cut its throat. The blood was drained into the chalice lying on the naked belly of the woman altar and handed to Marie. Gibor smeared blood from it on his penis, then on the woman's vagina. Then they had sex. In the following months, Marie went on to describe a number of similarly gory ceremonies at the pavilion in Rue Beauregard. Quote, she remembered that Pelletier, an assistant, brought 2 afterbirths to Gibor, one of which was later distilled by Pelletier and the other by Dumesnil, another assistant. It is also true that a midwife who lived at the corner of the Rue des Deux Portes also distilled the entrails of a child which the mother had borne there, brought by Voisin for an abortion. Before the distillation, the child's entrails and the mother's afterbirth had been taken to Gibor by her mother, on whose belly her mother, on her return, said Gibor had celebrated Mass, and that the woman was then still all covered with blood. What made the testimony particularly difficult was that amongst the most notable celebrants at the worst black masses was the king's mistress, Françoise Athénée de Mortemart, Marquise de Montespan. Quote, a child that appeared to have been prematurely born was presented at Madame de Montespan's Mass by order of her mother Deschet. Gibor put it into a basin, cut its throat, poured the blood into a chalice, and consecrated it with the host. Finished the host, then took out the child's entrails. The next day, the mother, Voisin, took to Dumesnil to be distilled, the blood and the host in a glass phial, which Madame de Montespan took away. The child's body was burnt in a stove by Mother Voisin. That last remark, almost thrown away in the gory detail of Guibault's mass, was vital. La Reynie's team of officers sealed off the house in Rue Beauregard when they arrested the other occupants. Inside were ovens exactly as described by Marie, with forensic indications that they had been used as she claimed. Catherine Deschet and l'Abbaye Guibault confessed independently to the allegations of child sacrifice in satanic rituals. Deschet even boasted that she had personally been involved in the ritual death of more than 2,500 infants and fetuses in the 13 years she operated from the house at Villeneuve. The case is a classic example of the abuse of children as in satanic ritual. But its importance goes far beyond mere confirmation of the historic existence of such cults. Almost every key indicator recorded by modern therapists was patiently set down in La Reynie's official transcripts of hearings before the Chambre Ardente. The drinking of blood and urine, animal sacrifice, orgies involving adults and children, child sacrifice, chanting and blaspheming in the name of Satan or one of his pseudonyms. The practice of inducing abortions was common, and its importance to the ritual clear. One statement taken by La Reynie's team recorded the aborting of a fetus in a Rouen woman who knew nothing of the cult. She was given drugs to make her hallucinate during the operation carried out by La Lapère, and forced to agree that if the fetus were born alive, it was to be baptized with salt and water prior to being handed over to Deschet. The woman completed her side of the bargain and told the hearing that La Voisin had taken the fetus from her at the house in La Rue Beauregard with a smile. The specific content and appearances of the candles in the pavilion was also described. These two match the most common themes recorded today, even down to the use of human fat obtained from the bodies of those executed by Nicolas Levasseur for candles. This is a repeated allegation from 20th century adult survivors. Wow. In the Chambre Ardente transcripts, there is even passing mention of the use of snakes in the satanic rituals. 300 years before Michelle Smith and those who followed after her disclosed identical rites, Deschet's goddaughter, La Filastre, told the hearings that Guibault had first sacrificed her baby on the altar, then consecrated a number of adders for use in the ensuing ceremony. It was hardly surprising, given the involvement of his mistress, that Louis XIV attempted to suppress all publicity surrounding the affair. By allowing the Chambre Ardente hearings in the first place, he had taken a considerable risk. Not only did they threaten to implicate much of his court, but the very idea that Satanism had a strong hold on the French aristocracy was politically impossible to acknowledge. Nor is it particularly remarkable that La Reynie found himself subjected to a smear campaign, curiously similar to those directed at today's professionals dealing with satanic ritual abuse. The commissioner was undoubtedly vulnerable as a mere functionary, confronting those in positions of power and influence. Equally, his use of sometimes brutal strong-arm methods to obtain results was potentially damaging to the credibility of the entire investigation. It is a credit to the thoroughness of his methods that unequivocal physical evidence of the substantive allegations was found to support the witnesses' testimony. What makes the Guibourg case truly unusual is that it progressed to a reliable conclusion. 104 men and women were convicted by the secular legal system and sentenced variously to death, slavery in French galleys, or banishment. But there was one other feature which would be echoed in modern cases. None of the high-ranking nobles who jointly controlled the cult were ever dealt with. Historic Satanism in Britain. In marked contrast to the meticulous recordings of satanic worship in Europe, there is comparatively little trustworthy evidence of the phenomenon in Britain. In part, this is probably due to the differing religious climate. Most satanic liturgy and practice, particularly the Black Mass, is specifically directed at defiling the Catholic image and practice of Christianity. Since England had broken with the Roman Church in the 16th century and subsequently developed a radically different Protestant form of worship, continental Satanism with its Cathar origins would have been less relevant. This is not to say that devil worship involving the abuse and sacrifice of children was not practiced, nor that the law did not pursue what it saw as heresy. It is rather that the surviving records, vague and piecemeal though they are, indicate a far greater preoccupation amongst both celebrants and suppressors with traditional pagan worship of the moon goddess and the horned god. The first formal statute outlawing any form of witchcraft, brackets, no distinction was made between witchcraft and Satanism, was passed by the English Parliament in 1541. Although there had been previous unwritten common law strictures against pagan religions. 10 years later, the statute was expanded and renewed, and in 1562, witchcraft was listed as a capital offence. The following year, Scotland legislated against witchcraft, sorcery, and necromancy. North of the border, too, these offences were punishable by death. The pair of statutes set the tone for almost 2 centuries of violent persecution. Witches were sought out energetically and tried on the flimsiest of evidence. The accession of James Stuart to the united throne of England and Scotland added impetus to the suppression. James had been an eager devotee of the aesthetic John Knox and went on to write his own treatise on demonology. The first half of the 17th century saw the rise of witch-finders, whose notion of judicial process was frequently the long outlawed practice of swimming, quote unquote, tying the suspect tightly with ropes before throwing her into a pond to see if she floated. If she did, she was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent, but generally drowned. Some estimates suggest that more than 30,000 men and women were killed in the 3 centuries of officially sanctioned persecution against supposed witches. For this reason, the majority of surviving trial records are deeply unreliable. Confessions, quote unquote, wrung from alleged witches by tortures that would have disgraced the medieval inquisitors frequently yielded only tales of nighttime sorties with talking animals and flights on broomsticks. Yet in amongst the dross, there is the occasional revealing case. That of Isabel Gowdy is typical, and all the more valuable since no torture of any form was used to obtain her confession. In 1662, Gowdy was, by all accounts, an attractive red-haired young woman married to a dull and stupid farmer in the village of Loch Loy, near Aldern in Morrisshire. So her confession out of the blue and unashamed to the elders of her local kirk that April was as unexpected as it was detailed. Gowdy claimed she had been a practicing quote-unquote witch, brackets, as elsewhere in Europe no official distinction was drawn between witches and Satanists, for 15 years. She admitted attending Shabbats, where she regularly enjoyed sexual intercourse with the devil. Her 4 confessions contain interesting parallels both with contemporaneous French reports and some of the disclosures recorded by 20th century therapists. Her initiation into the cult by the Satan figure took place at night inside the church at Aldern. Quote, "It is with good reason that legitimate modern pagans view with distrust the campaign of evangelical Christians to bring back laws prohibiting pagan worship. Not unreasonably, they fear a return to the days of witch-finders and kangaroo courts. The evangelical campaign will be examined in chapter 8. The devil, whom she described as a large, black, hairy figure, stood in the pulpit reading a liturgy from a black book, during which she was required to renounce and denounce Christ. Then a woman celebrant held her while the devil sucked blood from her shoulder, leaving a visible mark, and baptized her with it. Gaudi said she went a few nights later to a meeting of female witches where the devil first had sex with her and then with the remaining 12 women. Gaudi described this group as a coven, the first recorded use of the word in a case of witchcraft, and additionally the first suggestion that 13 was the requisite number of celebrants at a satanic ceremony. The confessions thus far would not have been particularly unusual within the context of other witchcraft trials, but Gaudi went on to describe the ritual sacrifice of 2 very young children at a coven meeting. The records of the case are incomplete and patchy. There is no record of Gaudi's age or the sentence she received, but it appeared the killings were done in the devil's name and some use made of the blood and bodies. Anthropologists and academic historians of occultism in Britain have been sharply divided by the Gaudi confessions. Whilst most accept that the evidence was given voluntarily and indeed corroborated by co-defendants and without duress, the verdicts on her motivation differ dramatically. The anthropologist Dr. Margaret Murray has argued that she belonged to a pagan fertility cult in which a man dressed up as the horned god. Others have denounced her evidence as the ramblings of a lunatic. This has been made easier by Gaudi's apparently unshakable belief in events that could not possibly have occurred, being taken to a coven meeting in another world, accessible only when the hillside magically opened. Yet this same argument has been used to deride the disclosures of modern child victims. Since there are distinct similarities between Gaudi's confessions and their stories, the possibility exists that the case was a genuine recording of satanic ritual abuse. The persecutions which had flourished under the Tudor and Stuart monarchs began to be discouraged by the courts towards the close of the 17th century. With the ending of the witch hunts, the recording of satanic worship all but disappeared for nearly 200 years. One exceptional case, however, is revealing. Once again, it contains some of the key indicators familiar to modern therapists and law enforcement officers. On Good Friday in the year 1728, a young British aristocrat sat in the Sistine Chapel in Rome, watching an age-old ritual. The celebrants, Catholic priests all, were performing a ceremonial scourging in memory of that which Christ endured just prior to his crucifixion. Suddenly the young man stood up, drew out a hefty whip from beneath his coat, and lashed anyone within his range. If the priest's scourging had been a symbolic ritual, this was the complete opposite, a wild, furious attack on worshippers within the chapel. The ensuing ejection of Sir Francis Dashwood from the Sistine was swiftly followed by his expulsion from Italy. It was a curious beginning for a political career that led to Dashwood's appointment as Chancellor of the Exchequer, but was wholly in keeping with the reputation he had already begun to build. Satanism in 18th century England appears to have been a privileged affair. Although historical records are sketchy, the cult seem to have attracted the idle young bucks of the still ascendant aristocracy. Groups with bizarre and threatening names, the Sons of Midnight, the Banditti, and the Blasters, haunted the fashionable parts of London, attempting to emulate the debauched evil of French satanic rituals. Most infamous of all the groups were the Hellfire Clubs. Mainland Britain boasted at least 3 in London and 3 more in Scotland, and there was a notably active branch in Ireland, led by the miniature painter Peter Lenz. Sir Francis Dashwood managed to raise his subdivision of the loose federation to a peak of orgiastic Satanism. Dashwood was a paradox, at times cultured and aesthetically sensitive, at others a coarse and heartless pervert. Like many young men of his time and class, his formal education was extremely limited. He had never attended a school, let alone university, yet he knew enough theology to control an avowedly satanic religion. The date of the formation of Dashwood's Club is unclear, but by 1721, when Dashwood was still in his late teens, the group's activities led to a royal proclamation. That April, George I issued an edict condemning certain scandalous clubs or societies of young persons who meet together and in the most impious and blasphemous manner insult the sacred principles of our holy religion, affront Almighty God himself, and corrupt the minds and morals of one another. No detailed accounts of the Hellfire Club's rituals survive, but from the fragmentary records, it is clear that the ceremonies employed a traditional Black Mass liturgy, blaspheming and abusing the crucifix to defile the concept of Christianity. Some reports suggest that the devil, brackets whom Dashwood publicly boasted was invoked, took the shape of a black cat. Others speak of the more familiar goat figure. Dashwood, by now Chancellor of the Exchequer, set about enticing other louche aristocrats into the fraternity with the lure of enormous quantities of alcohol, drugs, and free sex. The Earl of Sandwich, the poet Charles Churchill, son of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and probably the Earl of Bute, Prime Minister for much of this period, were enthusiastic celebrants at the orgiastic rituals. Unsurprisingly, the sex was not limited either to heterosexual intercourse or to adult participants. Throughout the more than 40 years that he ran the club, Dashwood had periods of apparently sincere repentance, in which he would embrace the Christian church with the same fervour with which he had previously celebrated his Satanism. This constant switching between 2 rival and equally dogmatic religions is a feature of modern adult satanic cult survivors. When in 1745 Dashwood married, he solemnly renounced his involvement with the club, which did not last. In 1753, he shifted the cult to a new base on his estate in Medmenham, near West Wickham, Buckinghamshire. He called the members monks, and rituals were centered around the ruined abbey. Each quote-unquote monk was provided with an individual cell in which to accomplish private rituals with a variety of paid and juvenile victims. Dashwood was nothing, though, if not self-protecting. He called himself secretary of the Hellfire Club at Medmenham, but gave its organisation over to a professional procurer, one Paul Whitehead. Whitehead saw to it that the Satanic temple was constructed with complete secrecy. No local labour was used, and every artisan was forced to swear an oath not to disclose any detail of its ornamentation. After its completion, only fully initiated members of the club were admitted. The sexual rituals took place on its threshold. Whitehead personally burnt all records of the rituals at the Abbey just before he died. But sufficient piecemeal accounts and descriptions survive to place the rituals squarely within the Guibourg tradition. The celebrants at the Black Mass wore the robes and hoods of Franciscan monks. On the altar, a naked young girl lay, her legs apart. Around her, a split chalice, a rosary, and a missal were arranged symmetrically. The priest conducted the ceremony using the girl as the altar and the channel of communication to Satan. At the moment of the offertory, he placed a host marked with the cross inside her vagina. The orgy took place at the end of the Mass. There are some indications that the Mass may periodically have included a sacrifice, but to what extent this was symbolic and whether animals or human is impossible to ascertain. Charles Churchill recorded one typical ritual in his poetry. Whilst womanhood in the habit of a nun at Medmenham lies, by backward nuns undone, a nation's reckoning like an alehouse score, whilst Paul the aged chalks behind a door, compelled to hire a foe to cast it up, Dashwood shall pour from a communion cup libations to the goddess without eyes. I'll read that again because I messed it up. Whilst womanhood in the habit of a nun at Medmenham lies, by backward nuns undone, a nation's reckoning like an alehouse score, whilst Paul the aged chalks behind a door, compelled to hire a foe to cast it up, Dashwood shall pour from a communion cup libations to the goddess without eyes. Internal dissent within the cult, coupled with a final repentance by Dashwood, ended the rituals in the 1770s. That it survived for more than half a century was perhaps due to the presence at the celebration of senior figures within the government and House of Lords, who succeeded in concealing the excesses of the ceremonies. Again, curiously, there is a common allegation contained in the disclosures of both adult and child survivors today that senior politicians are sometimes involved. 19th century Satanism. The rituals performed at Medmenham are the last recorded acts of satanic ritual in England for more than a century. Perhaps it's no coincidence that as the age of reason, the 18th century with its distrust of Christianity and its skeptical anti-clericalism, became overtaken by the Industrial Revolution, there should have been a corresponding religious revival. Although there's clear evidence of pagan worship, if not of Satanism, these were the great years of Victorian Christianity, the flourishing of Methodism, and the social necessity of attendance at chapel or church. There are indications, however, that satanic worship continued unabated across the Channel. Two books in particular fired the debate, Là-bas and Le Diable au 19th century, 19e siècle. Both were fiction based on fact. The easier of the two of an autobiographical novel by the writer Jory Carl Huysmans. Born in 1848, Huysmans spent his working life in the Direction de la Sûreté Générale, the division of the Interior Ministry, responsible for criminal intelligence and espionage. Although normally fiction, Là-bas, published in 1891, was explicitly suited to be fact under a thin disguise. Certainly, Husman's insisted that the satanic rituals he described in no little detail were the result of his own patient and first-hand journalism. Nonetheless, he failed to produce any documentary evidence to support his claims. The leader of the cult in the novel, Canon Duke Dolk, is patently identifiable as a Belgian-born priest, Louis van Hecker. Dolk and van Hecker perform a black mass much in the Gieborg tradition, with the added refinement that it takes place in the chapel of an Ursuline convent. What makes the descriptions useful is the first explicit mention of drugs being employed to make the celebrants frenzied in their blasphemies and debaucheries. Since Là-bas, this has been a constant feature of ritual abuse disclosures. Fact or fiction, it's impossible to prove. Yet because Husman's included within the text a transcript of an entire Black Mass, and one which closely resembles the Gieborg Mass, public recognition of Satanism spread throughout Europe once again. Whether as a result of the publicity surrounding Là-bas, or whether by coincidence, Le Diable au 19e siècle was published a year later. The authorship remains something of a mystery. It was ostensibly the work of one Dr. Bataille, but in all probability a committee of Christians assisted a recent graduate of the Faculty of Medicine at Montpellier University, Charles Hacks, to write the work. In addition to corroborating all that Huysman detailed in Là-bas, Dr. Bataille, quote unquote, introduced the first grand conspiracy theory of satanic ritual crime. The book put forward the argument, backed by a series of alleged eyewitness reports, that Satanism was rampant from Paris to Hong Kong via India, and that its controlling organization was part of Freemasonry. All the by now familiar ceremonies, blasphemies, sacrifices, and abuses were documented, but it's the connection made between Satanism and Freemasonry which was unique. As we shall see shortly, just such a link was being forged when Le Diable au 19e siècle was published. The Devil of the 19th Century. Whether the book is reliable is open to some doubt. The very detail of some of the descriptions is impressive, yet the ceremonies described around the globe appear to mix a number of different religions and cannot be counted as purely satanic. Equally, Dr. Bataille and his advisors were producing a book aimed squarely at a Christian audience, and it was written from a standpoint of unquestioning evangelism, in that at least it fits the pattern of much of the campaigning that was to follow 100 years later. Children in satanic ritual. A history of satanic worship from medieval times to the dawn of the 20th century is inextricably linked with the abuse and sacrifice of children. But if history details what happened, it does not explain why. What was the motive for the use and abuse of infants in these rituals? The idea of child sacrifice is common to most organized religions. In the Old Testament, God encourages Abraham to give his son Isaac as a human offering, but relents before the child is killed. The basis of Christianity itself is the notion of Christ's sacrificial death, Christ being described as the Son of God. Classical religions, too, exhibit clear evidence of child sacrifice within their orthodox rituals. Child sex abuse and murder were integral parts of the rites practiced by worshippers of Bacchus in ancient Greece, and the early Hercules myths, themselves a key element in classical pantheism, contain several references to the sacrifice of young children. These records also provide the first indication of why the deaths were deemed necessary. The children were offered as sacrificial substitutes for Hercules, in a plea to his gods to extend his reign. Brackets, in this version of the myth, he is a king figure reigning over an agricultural community. This concept of appeasing violent deities continued through the pagan cults of medieval Europe. But with the emergence of Cathar-influenced Satanism, the abuse of children within rituals took on a different meaning and importance. The first formalized ritual child sacrifice within the Black Mass is credited to Catherine de' Medici, 1519 to 1589, the daughter of an established occultist, Lorenzo de' Medici, and wife of King Henry II of France. Catherine introduced a variation of the theory of sacrifice to appease the devil. Her rituals were conducted for the purpose of obtaining the resolution of a specified problem. Her son Philip's curious wasting illness was a typical example. The spilling and consumption of a child's blood and flesh were deemed to release important magical powers. Brackets, however ridiculous this medieval notion appears, we need once again to remember that our own secular belief system is irrelevant. What matters is whether the religious faith of others leads them to commit offenses. Medici's satanic religion did just that, and the deeply held belief in the primitive power of ritual abuse and sacrifice continues today. This was a new theology based on an ancient mystical belief in the spiritual power of blood, and combined with the Cathar-influenced satanic obsession with the defilement of the most common Christian images of innocence, childhood. The Medici Mass was undoubtedly the forerunner of the Guibourg version, but the belief in the magical force created by children's death spread quickly across Europe to be blended with local traditions. Thus, in the late 16th century, the Basque region had its own variant, the Mass of the Saint-Césaire, during which death spells were enacted using water from a well in which an unbaptized child had previously been drowned. The key to all these post-Medici beliefs was the importance of child abuse and bloodletting in obtaining the assistance of Satan for a particular task. In the Guibourg Masses, said for the Marquise de Montespan, the sacrifice was part of a rite intended to lure the king away from a rival mistress and back to Montespan's bed. The baby's blood was drunk as part of the ritual, smeared on Guibourg's penis just before he had sex with the Marquise. Finally, the entrails and blood were mixed and taken away in a phial by Montespan to be given to Louis as a love potion. The refinements introduced by Catherine Deschet during her masses came to dictate the reasoning for later child abuse and sacrifice. Where Lavoisin had enjoyed easy access to human fat for her ceremonial candles from the executioner Nicolas Levasseur, later satanic groups were less fortunate. By the beginning of the 19th century, there is evidence that some cults believed that using the fat of babies or fetuses in candles and anointing oils released a powerful magical force. In Britain, particularly during the persecution era, a variation of the theory was recorded. De Lancre noted the superstition that eating the flesh of a child who had never spoken articulate words, a baby, created a form of sympathetic magic which would prevent the witch or Satanist's own tongue from confessing their rituals. Quote, in order not to confess the secrets of the school, they made at the Shabbat a paste of black millet with the powder made from the dried liver of an unbaptized child. It has the virtue of taciturnity, so that whoever eats it will never confess. That this belief was put into practice is confirmed by the records of witch trials. At Forfar, Scotland, in 1661, One Helen Guthrie stated that she had other witches had dismembered the body of an unbaptized baby and took several parts thereof, as the feet, hands, a part of the head, and a part of the buttock, and that they made a pie thereof, that they might eat of it, that by this means they might never make confession of their witchcrafts. Despite the evident failure of the ritual, the belief in its power apparently continued. A generation later, witches, quote unquote, at Barragan, Renfrewshire, said at their trial that Satan, whom they called their Lord, gave them a piece of an unchristened child's liver to eat, telling them that though they were apprehended, they should never confess, which would prevent an effectual discovery. Perhaps much of this apparent satanic belief system might be dismissible as the superstition of ignorant rural people persecuted by an unyielding and tyrannical Christian church. Certainly, child abuse and sacrifice are allegations traditionally made by the one dominant religious creed against a rival. Nor is it a paranoid fear confined to religious warring. There was a widespread belief in Britain for much of the Great War that German soldiers abused, killed, and ate babies. We can see within this the makings of a folk devil or bogeyman myth. One modern figure, however, ensures that the historical phenomenon cannot be so easily dismissed. His name was Aleister Crowley, and his career, satanic theology, and rituals link the eras of Medici, Guibourg, and Haussmann with 20th century Satanism and its connections with some branches of Freemasonry. Aleister Crowley and the modern satanic ritual. Man has the right to love as he will, take your fill and will of love as ye will, when, where, and with whom ye will. Man has the right to kill those who would thwart those rights. Do what thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law. Written by Aleister Crowley, self-proclaimed great beast, Satanist, magician, and genius, was born Edward Alexander Crowley on the 12th of October 1875 at Leamington in Warwickshire. His father was a retired brewer who had become converted to the unforgiving and joyless Christian sect, the Plymouth Brethren. His mother, by his own account, was weak and tedious. Nothing and no one in the Crowley household could be described as remotely satanic, yet Aleister would become the single most important figure in 20th century Satanism, the man who transformed the cumbersome burlesque of post-Guibourg ritual into a sleek and altogether more menacing phenomenon. Crowley's great contribution was to convert the faith and practice of Satanism from a reliance on an external devil to the belief in worshipping and realizing the demonic inside the individual Satanist. 20th century Satanism is almost universally based on this introspective approach. Not that Crowley's rituals were purely academic or intellectual. Sex and sacrifice played just as big a role as in earlier ceremonies, limited only by the political problems of obtaining suitable victims without detection. Crowley grew up to despise the fundamentalist Christianity of his father and set out to subvert it. His early attempts were mere juvenile rebelliousness taken to an extreme degree, requesting the stillborn body of his baby sister for experimentation and subsequently dismembering a live cat instead, sleeping with his mother's maidservant in her bed, and enthusiastically embracing drink and drugs. After a conventional education at Malvern and Trinity College, Cambridge, Crowley read the works of a self-promoting contemporary occultist called Samuel Liddell Mathers and was quickly hooked on his theory of hermetic magic. Mathers, who likes to use the pseudonym MacGregor Mathers or the Comte de Glenstray, was the egomaniacal son of a commercial clerk from Hackney. By 1885, he had helped found an organisation called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and attracted a number of social and literary luminaries, W.B. Yeats being the most notable. The Golden Dawn members believed in the concept of Kabbalism. Based on a lengthy 13th century commentary, Zohar, on the first 5 books of Moses by a Spanish rabbi, the Kabbalah claims to describe the structure of the spiritual world as divided into 10 emanations of God, linked by 22 separate paths. According to the Zohar, man's physical world is the lowest of the 10, which together form a tree of life. The Golden Dawn's version of this was called the Hermetic tradition, allegedly in honor of its original founder, Hermes Trismegistus. Mathers and his late Victorian friends believed that magic was a powerful and real physical force which anyone could direct if only he followed certain properly ordained procedures, in short, rituals. These in turn were generally revealed to the initiates of the society by supernatural forces known as hidden chiefs. Crowley swallowed this bunkum entirely. He convinced himself in a hotel room in Stockholm that he too had the ability to be magical. In 1898, he became a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and set about practicing its ludicrous and sometimes criminal rituals. Subsequent court hearings made clear that some initiation rites involved bizarre ways of deflowering young girls. In 1901, 2 cult members were sentenced to 15 and 7 years jail respectively, for rape during the rituals. But the majority of Golden Dawn ceremonies involved merely dressing up in absurd costumes and invoking a variety of ancient Egyptian deities. Crowley soon tired of such anodyne play acting and in 1899 retired to a remote house in the Scottish Highlands, Boleskine House, to conduct his own rituals. Increasingly, these were based on ever more extreme variants of sexual intercourse and sadism. Inevitably, Boleskine House earned itself a reputation, but Crowley failed to come up with a convincing magical system. In 1903, he and his wife Rose meandered across the globe in search of inspiration, but finally, in Cairo, on 19th of March 1904, Crowley made the breakthrough he had longed for. In typical Golden Dawn tradition, he was attempting to invoke the Egyptian god Horus. At midnight, with his wife as the medium, a secret chief by the name of Aiwass informed him that the equinox of the gods has come, that a new epoch in human history had begun, and that I was to form a link between solar spiritual forces and mankind. Stripped of its pompous language, the message told Crowley that he was to be a messiah who would bring about the death of Christianity and replace it with a new form of religious doctrine. Precisely what form that would take, Aiwass would explain the following month. On the 8th, 9th, and 10th of April, Crowley claimed Aiwass dictated his scriptures. The result was what Crowley dubbed the Book of the Law. Amid the endless psychobabble, some themes are clear. I quote here, I peck at the eyes of Jesus as he hangs upon the cross. Let Mary inviolate be torn upon wheels. For her sake, let all chaste women be despised amongst you. Within this puerile blasphemy, curiously reminiscent of earlier Black Mass liturgy, one dominant theme emerged. The devil, or indeed any of his pantheistic pseudonyms, was no longer an external spiritual force to be worshipped or placated. It was an internal power to be released by every individual. Within every man and woman, according to Crowley, was the ultimate deity. Releasing this new concept of the Satan figure was to be accomplished, of course, through rituals. The key to their motivation, according to the Book of the Law, was the phrase, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." I was also apparently instructed Crowley to take as many drugs as possible in the course of rituals for this new religion. Crowley followed his orders with determination. If the Book of the Law does not contain phrases or draft liturgy that were instantly recognizable as satanic, Crowley devoted the following 3 decades to refining the new religion. This new Satanism, with its accompanying rituals, harked back to the Egyptian origins of the composite devil figure, rather than to the medieval image of the Giborg rites. Nonetheless, its ceremonies contained all the familiar ingredients. By 1907, Crowley was back at Boleskine House. He had ditched the pedestrian Order of the Golden Dawn in favour of forming his own organisation, Argentum Astrum, the Order of the Silver Star. He had also acquired a new disciple, an effeminate youth called Victor Neuberg, and developed complicated rituals based almost exclusively on ceremonial sex. Together, Crowley and Neuberg practiced their rituals, which generally involved acts of sodomy conducted within the traditional star and circle. He diarized these ceremonies carelessly from 1907 onwards, publishing them in the Silver Star's journal, Equinox. Most are tediously repetitive and absurdly self-important. 3 sections of the diaries, however, are revealing. Those describing their travels in North Africa, Paris, and America. In 1909, Crowley and Neuberg set off for North Africa to devote themselves to performances of Enochian magic. The ceremonies themselves were a collection of pantheistic, sexual, and symbolically sacrificial rituals. But the language they were conducted in is interesting. Enochian was the name given to a form of magic revealed to the Elizabethan occultist Dr. John Dee. It consists of a series of invocations to the devil in a variety of demonic disguises, using a language which reads and sounds like children's nonsense talk crossed with Latin. I read the quote here. It says, "In recent years, there have been repeated attempts by occult evangelists to find anodyne explanations for Crowley's more unpleasant maxims. Some have suggested that do what thou wilt, etc., actually means do only what you truly will yourself to accomplish. The lie to this disingenuousness is given by Crowley's enthusiastic and indiscriminate embracing of extreme hedonism." Madariatza das perifa lil cabisa Mikaola Sauda Sadira Kausago being a typical example. Patient analysis by modern therapists of child victims' recollection of the rituals they were forced to attend suggests that the strange chanting they heard was probably Enochian. Before Crowley published his rituals, there were no easily accessible Enochian rites for satanic groups to follow. The North African diaries he published 80 years ago have proved a fruitful legacy. 4 years later, Crowley and Neuberg retired to Paris to carry out a series of lengthy sex magic rituals. These Paris workings, as Crowley chose to call them, recorded a series of rites that are strikingly similar to many modern survivors' accounts. The 2 men gathered round them an unspecified number of other celebrants, and within a pentacle painted on the floor began a series of circular dances. Following on, Neuberg was ceremonially scourged on the buttocks prior to being bound with chains and an inverted cross carved on his chest. The ceremony concluded with an act of ritual sodomy within the pentacle. Crowley's records were the apparent presence of a large number. Crowley's records notes the apparent presence of a large number of snakes. The workings continued, increasingly involving the consumption of blood and feces. Finally, towards the end of the series, Neuberg claimed to have been told in a vision that the ultimate ritual would involve the kidnap, rape, and murder of a female child, cutting her body into 9 pieces and offering them as sacrifices to a variety of Greek gods or devil figures. Crowley's diaries indicate that even he shied away from this suggestion. But as his later actions and writings were to make clear, this was less a result of principle than the practical problems such a ritual would cause in the middle of a crowded city. One further specific set of ceremonies is revealing. By 1916, Crowley had decamped to America, where, true to form, he involved his disciples, quote unquote, in a series of drug-induced sex rituals financed through prostitution. The specific rite which makes Crowley of crucial significance to the historical context of Satanism, however, was his first performance of a black mass. In a ceremony he wrote and performed alone, he baptized a frog as Jesus of Nazareth, then sacrificed it, crucified it, stabbed it through its heart, chanting, quote, I, the great beast, slay thee, Jesus of Nazareth, the slave God. Give thy place to me, O Jesus, thine eon is past. The age of Horus is arisen by magic of the master, the great beast, that is man. Let it never be so, Jesus. Crowley may have announced the death of Christianity in the name of an Egyptian Satan figure, Horus, but his self-proclamation as the great beast places this ritual firmly within the traditional framework of biblical Satanism. The great beast to which he referred is the description given to Satan within the book of Revelations. To put the issue beyond doubt, Crowley subsequently wrote to a friend, to hell with Christianity, rationalism, Buddhism, and all the lumber of the centuries. I bring you a positive and primeval fact, black magic by name, and with this I shall build a new heaven and a new earth. I want none of your faint approval or faint dispraise. I want blasphemy, murder, rape, revolution, anything bad or good but strong. Crowley's increasing public profile had already attracted the attention of another occult group. He had been resting at Boleskine House in 1912 when a German Freemason called in unannounced. Theodor Reuss was the head of a secretive magical society, the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO. To Crowley's astonishment, Reuss bluntly accused him of betraying its private rituals. The OTO was, and still is, divided into traditional Freemasonic grades and degrees. Reuss told Crowley that he had published the secrets of the 9th grade, a relatively senior level, which Crowley, although a member, had never reached. It did not take much to realize that the OTO operated its rituals along similar sexual lines to those that Crowley had developed entirely independently. By the close of their conversation, Reuss had been persuaded that Crowley should be allowed to found an English branch of the order. It was a fateful decision. The OTO today is the most widely spread of all international satanic organizations. The order had been founded 8 years before Reuss met Crowley by a wealthy German ironmaster, Karl Kellner. From the outset, it was a Masonic splinter group, using a small Berlin sect, the Grand Lodge of Memphis and Mizraim, as its launch pad, though it claimed to be directly descended from the medieval Knights Templar. Kellner died in 1905, and Reuss took over the organization. By the time Reuss met Crowley, the order published a journal, Oriflamme, which made direct reference to the nature of its rituals and its connection with Freemasonry. Our order possesses the key which opens up all Masonic and Hermetic secrets, namely the teaching of sexual magic. And this teaching explains, without exception, all the secrets of Freemasons and all systems of religion. 5 years later, with Royce completely under Crowley's influence, the order issued a manifesto. Quote, "This organization is a modern school of magic, and like the ancient schools of magic, it derived its knowledge from the East. This knowledge was never revealed to the profane because it gave immense power for either good or evil to its possessors. The OTO is a body of initiates in whose hands are concentrated the secret knowledge of all Oriental orders of existing Masonic degrees. Its chiefs are initiates of the highest rank and recognized as such by all capable of such recognition in every country of the world. The order is international and has existing connections in every civilized country in the world. Every man or woman who becomes a member of the OTO has an indefeasible right to the first 3 degrees of Masonry." The tract went on to outline a complicated hierarchy which ruled the order. Individual lodges were largely self-governing, at least within the framework of OTO theology. But the outer head of the order had the power to suspend the charter by which any lodge operated. It was, in fact, an early system of occult franchising. By the time Royce issued this manifesto, Crowley was no mere head of the English franchise. He had accumulated a collection of grand, if entirely meaningless, titles, and had established his Book of the Law as the basic text for all OTO groups. All previous rituals were revised in order to conform with Crowley's teachings, including the Black Mass he had performed in America and a subsequent Gnostic Mass in which the Christian bread wafer was replaced by quote-unquote cakes of light, ceremonial hosts largely composed of menstrual blood. Royce suffered a stroke in 1920. 2 years later, he resigned as outer head of the order and nominated Crowley as his successor. Not all OTO groups were prepared to accept him. It took until 1925 to bring the majority of the German lodges into line, and the loyalty of other branches was occasionally lukewarm. This reluctance was hardly surprising. Crowley's personal and occult behavior was increasingly satanic. Quote, "My master is Satan, resist not evil," he preached. And sections of the British press were paying him uncomfortably close attention. By then, Crowley was in any event close to bankruptcy. His travels around the world, coupled with an insatiable appetite for heroin and cocaine, had all but exhausted his limited funds. Only a legacy of $3,000 from the death of an aunt in 1920 kept him afloat. He decided to spend it on a purchase of a ruined farmhouse at Elafu, a small port in northern Sicily. He and his latest lover, Leah Herzig, his wife Rose had by this time lapsed into alcoholism and died, renamed the house the Abbey of Thelema, the word Crowley had used to describe the theology contained in his Book of the Law. If he called his revised form of Satanism by a new and untainted name, its practice bore a remarkable similarity to what went before it, and what child survivors would come to disclose more than 60 years later. The central hall of the abbey was converted into a temple. In the center, Crowley placed an altar, and on it a whip, a phallus, and his black book of rituals. On the floor in front of the altar, he painted a large circle containing an inverted pentagram. The walls were adorned with obscene paintings. One showed a man being sodomized by a goat figure, Baphomet. In addition to the Gnostic and Black Masses, Crowley led his disciples through ever more traditional Satanic ceremonies. In one Mass, Leah Herzig acted as priestess and offered to Crowley the Eucharist, quote unquote. In place of the Christian wafer representing the body of Jesus was a silver plate bearing Herzig's feces. Crowley solemnly ate it. All the rituals at Salafu were sexually orientated and were directed at the worship of evil for evil's sake. Sacrifice too played a part. During one rite, Crowley ritually disemboweled a live cat before collecting its blood in a chalice and passing it to the celebrants for drinking. In a subsequent ceremony, Leah Herzig, representing Mary, Mother of Christ, had sex within the circle with a goat. At the climax of the ritual, Crowley slit the animal's throat and once again passed round its blood for consumption. The rituals at the Abbey of Thelema lasted until 1923, when a baby disappeared from a neighbouring village. Crowley was accused of abducting and killing it during a ritual. On the 23rd of April, Crowley was summoned to the police station in Kalafu to be told that Mussolini had ordered his expulsion. On the 1st of May, closely guarded by local police, the great beast was summarily ejected. No charges were ever brought over the missing infant. Once again, he travelled the world, staying variously in Tunis, Paris, London, and Germany. The latter destination was rather less haphazardly chosen than the others. Crowley went to Thuringia to accept Theodore Royce's nomination as head of the OTO. After Royce nominated Crowley as his successor, the German branches of the order initially split into three opposing groups. The first, led by its acting head Heinrich Trenker, utterly rejected Crowley. Trenker had been appalled by the contents of the Book of the Law, viewing them as an elaborately disguised modern Satanism. The second group, under Eugene Gröscher, acknowledged Crowley as an important teacher, but declined to support him as head of the movement. Only the third branch, led by a man called Karl Germer, accepted Crowley and his satanic religion of Thelema entirely. For more than a decade, Germer would support Crowley, now calling himself the Master Therion, and his workings, magic, financially and politically. Significantly for the OTO, Germer would subsequently become outer head of the order. At the time, however, Crowley managed to occupy that position himself. He was also engaged in writing his magnum opus, Magic in Theory and Practice. In part, this was intended as a sequel to one of his several volumes expounding the theology of Thelema, but Crowley also wanted to write a manual for newcomers to follow and thereby understand the concept and rituals of his religion. Quote, "My former work has been misunderstood and its scope limited by my use of technical terms. It has attracted only too many dilettanti and eccentrics, weaklings, seeing in magic an escape from reality. I have written this book to help the banker, the pugilist, biologist, the mathematician, the stenographer, the golfer, the wife, the consul, and all the rest to fulfill themselves perfectly, each in his or own proper function." But when he finished the manuscript in 1926, he found no British publisher prepared to accept it. The reason was contained in chapter 12, entitled Of the Bloody Sacrifice. "The question is indeed traditionally important in magic." This is a quote from the book. "The bloody sacrifice has from time immemorial been the most considered part of magic. The ethics of the thing appear to concern no one, nor to tell the truth need they do so. However, there is a mystery concealed in this theory of the bloody sacrifice, which is of great importance to the student. The mystery Crowley explained was that blood is life and that any living being stored up huge quantities of magical energy within his, her, or its body. The actual quality and quantity of this spiritual force depended on the size, health, morality, and mental potential of the living being. To release this energy, all that was necessary was to kill the creature in question. The animal should therefore, this is quoting again, the animal should therefore be killed within the circle so that its energy cannot escape. An animal should be selected whose nature accords with that of the ceremony. For the highest spiritual working, one must accordingly choose that victim which contains the greatest and purest force. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory and suitable victim. In a footnote to the text, Crowley claims to have carried out this particular sacrifice on an average about 150 times every year between 1912 and 1928. The resultant figure, 2,400 boys apparently murdered, has led some occultists to suggest either that the sacrifice was in some way symbolic or that the whole section was an elaborate black joke. Neither apologia holds water, however. The text is too specific to allow it to be read symbolically, and Crowley was subsequently to repeat in court his support for the efficacy of human sacrifice. In 1934, he sued the writer Nina Hamnet for libel over her description of his ceremonies as black magic. The publishers of Hammet's offending book fought the case, and in the course of cross-examination, Crowley was asked, "You believe as a magician in bloody sacrifice?" "Yes." "You say for nearly all purposes human sacrifice is best?" "Yes, it is." Whether Crowley actually carried out the number of human sacrifices magic in theory and practice claims, and the likelihood is that he exaggerated considerably, is to some extent irrelevant. The book was intended as a modern satanic primer. As we shall see in the next chapter, generations of individual Satanists and organized groups have taken it as such. Carl Germer, Crowley's ardent supporter with OTO, had no reservations about the book. He and one of Crowley's wealthy disciples, Gerard York, arranged and paid for its publication in Paris after British publishers turned it down. It eventually appeared in 1931 and has been available ever since. Crowley himself spent the remaining years of his life in poverty, racked by an addiction to cocaine and heroin in ever more potent doses. He had claimed during the Hamnet libel trial never to have been a Satanist and to have fought black magic for many years. The truth was the reverse, and his lie was finally exposed by the funeral service he requested. He died on the 1st of December 1947 and was cremated in Brighton 4 days later. On a grey winter afternoon, his disciples intoned the Black Mass he had written for the occasion. Quote, "Satan has come on a milk-white arse. I seem to have got in the grip of a snake. I am home to death on the horns of a unicorn." Brighton Council, and indeed the town's population, were outraged, as Crowley must have known they would be. It was part of his nature to enjoy playing the eternal bogeyman for the local bourgeoisie. The more important legacy, however, was his determined redefinition of the concept and rituals of Satanism, drawing it away from a medieval reliance on the external devil to a belief in empowering Satan within the individual celebrant. It was a legacy that has lasted until the last years of this century. However, If the intellectual theology of Crowleyan Satanism was updated for the 20th century, the rituals still relied on the staple ingredients of the previous 500 years: sex, abuse, blasphemy, bestiality, the eating of body waste, and the sacrifice of children. Had the Independent on Sunday examined the history of satanic worship during its much trumpeted 1990, quote, investigation, it could never have dismissed the tortured testimony of modern child survivors as a, quote, satanic myth. The records of satanic crime from medieval Europe to Crowley's, quote-unquote, new religion of Thelema contain every single key indicator identified by those who work with its modern victims. Even toddlers around the world have studied the rituals of Gilles Ray, the Abbé Guibourg, and Aleister Crowley and repeated them almost verbatim, or they are telling the truth. The weight of evidence points to the latter option, and as we shall see, the story of modern Satanism serves only to confirm it. That is the end of chapter 3. I did not enjoy that, and I, as you heard me, cover myself with the protection that comes with acknowledging Jesus Christ as my Saviour. AngelasCaches.org, no apostrophe, CACHES. Angela Power Disney on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you to Craig McGowan for this transcript. God bless.